Demonstrate how a quant trader might use the dplyr package to very efficiently manipulate stock price data. So first I'm going to load the dplyr package, which is bundled as part of the tidyverse package in R. Then I'm going to use this read RDS command here to read some price data. Now that's populated my global environment here with a data frame called prices, which contains nicely organized daily price data for 3 energy stocks. I've got CVX, XOM, and I've got another one I can't remember. Now this data is organized quite nicely for analysis using dplyr. So you can see that each column here is a variable and each row is an observation. In this data set, we've got 13,314 rows. Each row represents a daily price observation for a given stock. And for each observation, we've got the open, high, low, close, and the traded volume for that stock. So you can see that, for example, we've got 2 rows for the 31st of December. We've got 2 rows for the 2nd of January 1998 here. So a row represents an observation for a given stock for a given date. And this is a very helpful way to structure your price data. I'm going to show you how dplyr is going to make that easy for you. So there's 3 main dplyr verbs that you need to know about. There's filter, which picks out observations by some criteria, picks out rows by some criteria. Arrange, which reorders your rows based on some criteria. Select, which pulls out columns or variables from the data. Mutate, which creates new columns or new variables by applying transformations to the existing ones. And summarize, which allows you to summarize the data, reducing it from lots of rows to fewer rows. Finally, the group by verb causes those verbs above to act upon groups of data rather than the complete data, rather than the whole data set. And we'll go through that one by one. So the first one, filter. So filter, we've got our data set called prices, and just to remind you of what that looks like, I'm going to select prices, hit Control Enter, and that'll show you the complete data set. I'm going to pipe that into the filter function, and the filter function is just going to return the rows that match this filter criteria here. So I'm saying, well, give me the rows where the ticker, this guy over here, is equal to XOM. I'm going to run that by pressing the green thing. And now you can see I've reduced down my data set. So I've only got the rows, the observations for which the ticker is equal to XOM. And note that we need to use 2 equal signs here. Common errors to use 1. So we've reduced ours down to 5,500 rows from, if we look at the whole unfiltered data set, we had 13,000 in the filter data set. Now, often we want to select groups. Okay, so in this case, I just want to select XOM and CVX. So I use this command here, pound in pound, and then I select and I give it a vector. So if my ticker appears in that list or that vector, so if it's either XOM or CVX, it's going to return it. I can see now I've got CVX and XOM appearing in my data here. So that's filter. That's just taking, we pass lots of rows, we pass some criteria, and we get fewer rows. Now, arrange is next. Arrange is just reordering the rows in your data. So let's remind ourselves of what's in our data. If I can select this, okay. So when I do that, I'm just selecting, press Control Enter in RStudio, and RStudio is just going to run the stuff that I've selected. I can see if I arrange by volume, so if I arrange by volume, I'd expect to see, in fact, I already have done that. If I price arrange by volume, I'd expect to see all my rows in increasing order of volume. So if I go up to the top, I see the highest volume. Go to the bottom, I see the lowest volume. Now, if I wanted to do that in descending order, I can put descending around that there. Now that's going to order the rows of my data set by volume descending. So we start with the biggest at the top. Okay. Now what I also can do is I can sort by multiple criteria. So in this case, I'm sorting by descending date and then sorting by volume ascending. And you can see there that I've got the most recent observations in my data set. The most recent observation is the 3rd of January, 2020. And I can see that within the 3 records that I've got on that date, I've sorted them by ascending volume order. Again, the same is true of the 2nd of January. So that's a range. Very, very simple, I think. Just a sort. Next up, next verb, we're on to select. Now, select just pulls out columns. So sometimes you'll have a really long data set, might have, I don't know, 100 columns in it. So loads of stuff in it, but you don't care about 100 things. You only care about 3 things. So we can use select just to pull out the columns that we're interested in. So remember, prices has ticker, date, open, high, low, close, volume. If I use select to select out ticker, date, and close, now I'm only getting that subset of columns there. The next step is we're going to look at chaining transformations together. So we've looked at filter, we've looked at select, and we've looked at arrange. So I'm going to use those transformations put together to first filter out prices only relating to Exxon, then only pull out the date and the close column, and then filter those by descending date. Now, a useful thing when I chain this stuff together like this is to run it bit by bit. And you've already seen me do this a little bit. So if I select prices, then go Control Enter, that's my whole data set. So that's everything that I'm sending into that pipeline. Now I'm going to select the next thing along. And you know what this does? This just filters out the Exxon rows. And I can do that, and I can check that now I've only got the Exxon rows in my data set. Now let's select the next bit. So prices, filter out the Exxon rows, only select date and close. So I do that. Now I've just got date and close. And then let's finally pipe it into this arrange function, which is just going to sort it by date descending. You can see it's date ascending at the moment. If I run the whole lot, now you can see I've run that transformation, and I'm doing date descending now, and my most recent date is at the top. Next verb is mutate. We're getting slightly more exciting at this point when we're talking about mutate, because we're actually we're actually doing stuff to the data. We're creating new data now rather than just filtering or sorting or organizing the data. So mutate lets us add variables or columns to the end of our data. And that's usually useful if it's derived from existing columns that already exists in our data. So here's an example. We often need to transform traded volume because it tends to obey a kind of power law. So often we're taking the log of traded volume. So let's do that explicitly in our data. Remember what our prices data look like? Here it is. So we've got ticker, date, open, high, low, close. If we do mutate, we're saying create a new column or a new variable called log volume and make it equal to the log of the column that we've got called volume. So if I run that, now I see a new column on the end of my data frame, which is just simply the log of the volume on that row. Here's another example. So we might care about the returns of each stock during the day. So the returns from the open to the close. So here we create a new column, which is going to be called intraday returns using our mutate function. We're going to take the close price, divide it by the open, and take away 1. And that'll give us the simple fractional returns from the open to the close. And there we go. So that was nice and easy because both the open and the close existed on the row that we wanted to do that on. Now, if we wanted to do the close-to-close returns day to day, we'd need to do something a little more complicated. And we'll come to that at the end of this of this video. So that's mutate. Mutate just puts a new variable or a new column in our data. Now let's go on to summarize. So the summarize function summarizes all of our observations, all of our rows into a single row. So we're collapsing lots of rows down into a single row here. So I'm going to use that to calculate the mean volume, the mean daily volume traded over the entire data set. So I take prices, pipe it into our summarize function, and I'm going to summarize the volume. So I'm going to summarize by taking the mean of the volume there. And there I get that. And now that's essentially the mean daily volume over every row. So our 3 stocks every single day. And you know, we can put 2 summaries in here if we want. So if we wanted an observation count, we can use this n function here, which will take the which essentially will summarize the number of records that we've got there. Lost my mouse pointer. Where is he? There he is. So now I've got the count of the number of rows, and I've got the mean of volume. And you know, I could put all kinds of stuff in here really. If I wanted to put the sum of the volume, I can also do this, for example. I've lost him. Now I've got the sum as well. Okay, so that's not always very useful though, because it's, you know, it is useful to summarize our entire data set, but usually what we want to do is we want to group it first and then summarize it. So usually we're using summarize with group by to calculate the mean traded volume of something, or summarize something by something else. In this case, we're going to look for the mean traded volume for each stock separately. So I'm taking prices, I'm using the group by command that's saying, look, split all my data into separate groups for each unique ticker. So I'm going to have an Exxon ticker, I'm going to have an Exxon group, I'll have a CVX group, for example. Then for each of those groups, separately apply the summarize function, and then return that summary for every single distinct value of that group. So if I do this, I now expect 3 rows, and I expect to see the mean volume for each of these 3 stocks separately. Now we can do this with multiple variables. So I want to do that for each year for each stock. So I'm going to use mutate to calculate from the, and I'm going to use the year function from Lubridate. That's a date manipulation package to pull out the year part of the date. Then I'm going to group by the ticker and the year, and I'm going to calculate the mean volume. And you can see there now, instead of 1 row for each ticker, now I've got 1 row for each ticker and year combination. Okay. Now, final thing, we've covered nearly everything. In fact, we have covered everything. We've covered all of the verbs, but there is a particular usage of group by, which is helpful. So it makes sense that we can use group by with summary, or summarize rather. You know, we group by a variable, then we reduce down that data and summarize it for each one of those variables or groups of variables. We can also use it with mutate, and when we use it with mutate, we get a data set which has the same number of rows as we passed in. We're not reducing the data down, but we're calculating separately for each of our groups. So an example which you'll use all the time as a quant trader is for calculating periodic returns. So we don't want to use observations from other stocks in our calculation of returns. So here we've taken prices, we're grouping by our stock, our ticker, and then we're taking the lagged returns. So we're taking close divided by the lagged close price and taking away 1. And you know, just to be explicit. We should probably do this to make sure that we've got our data in the right order, right? So because what we're doing here is we're taking the close price, dividing it by the previous close price to get our returns data. Now, the reason we need to group by ticker is because when we change ticker in our data set, our lagged row isn't necessarily going to be that same ticker. So by putting this group by ticker here, we ensure that returns are only calculated for Exxon for rows that relate to Exxon, for example. So this makes sure that no data from CVX or the other one I can't remember gets into our Exxon returns calculation. You can see here we've returned simple close to close returns for each observation, and our first two are not applicable because we only have that, because that's the first observation for that stock. Okay, well, that's just a nice usage of group by with Mutate, and using the lag function to say essentially get me my returns here are this close value divided by the previous one for that group that I'm looking at. So summary, make your life easier, arrange your data so every column is a variable and every row is an observation. That's then going to make it easy for you to use dplyr. And there's 6 functions that you need to know. And you'll see us use these over and over again, so you're going to get this pretty quick. Filter pulls out observations by some filter criteria. Arrange just reorders those rows. Select picks out the variables, and mutate creates new variables or new columns by applying transformations to those existing variables or other stuff that you bring in. Now, those 4 verbs will return you essentially a data set that's the same, or sorry, these 3 verbs will return you a data set that's the same size as the one that you passed in. Filter obviously is going to return you a data set that's got fewer rows than you passed in. Summarize is going to return you a data set which has got 1 row for every processing unit or group that you give it. So if you don't use group by, that's just going to reduce all of your data down to 1 row and just summarize all that stuff. If you do use a group by, it's going to tell dplyr to apply these things to explicit groups by the unique thing that you passed in here. So if you had 3 stocks and you group by stock and then summarize that in some way, you're going to get 3 rows out of that. Okay.